When Disciplines Meet is a series of podcasts from the Scottish Graduate School of Social Science, the UK's largest doctoral training partnership for social scientists. With these podcasts, we aim to discuss the aims, nature, and practical experiences of interdisciplinary approaches to research. This episode is on the topic of interdisciplinary perspectives of fueling homes. My name's Laura Young. I'm an interdisciplinary researcher and host of this podcast series. On this episode, I am joined by two guests who are based in Scotland. Professor Mette from the University of St Andrews, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
And also Professor Ken Gibb from the University of Glasgow. Welcome, Ken.
Hello.
I would love to kick off with hopefully an easy question, but who knows, Mette, to you. Which discipline are you from and how did you first become involved in research around fueling homes?
Well, my discipline is social anthropology. And my journey into the topic of fueling homes is not straightforward. It's been 15 years since I got my PhD that I got into this topic. So it has not been a straightforward journey. And it has taken me a while focusing on totally unrelated topics. But deep down, I'm an economic anthropologist. And that has led me into the topic of fueling homes.
And has your journey always been based in Scotland, or have you travelled with part of that?
So I got my PhD from Cambridge. And then my first job was at the London School of Economics. At that time, my research focused on Mongolia. I did fieldwork for a couple of years in the mountains of Mongolia, studying a gold rush. So it's totally unrelated to both Scotland and to homes, even to sustainability and climate change.
And Ken, what about yourself? What discipline are you from? And you know, when did you first get involved in research in fueling homes?
So I would describe myself as an applied economist. I have been working as an applied economist in housing since the late 1980s, always at the University of Glasgow. I actually I did a couple of small projects on fuel poverty quite a long time ago in the 1990s. And I was also briefly involved in a grant-making charity which provided money to fund research on fuel poverty and related issues. But it really only started in 2019 when an opportunity arose to do some research, which I kind of never looked back from, and I've constantly been doing something in this area ever since.
And when this topic, you know, people read fueling homes, they might think about heating, like heating bills, or, you know, whether you've got a renewable energy tariff or whether you've got gas or a heat pump. They might think of how leaky their home is and double glazing. But Mette, when we talk about this issue of fueling homes, what do we mean in the context of homes, infrastructure, climate change, social policy? What is the big issue that we're trying to address?
So my approach to this topic is informed by the fact that I'm leading a big research alliance here in Scotland called the Scottish Research Alliance for Energy, Homes and Livelihoods, funded by the SFC, the Scottish Funding Council. And in that context, we are working across disciplines and across sectors. So what does fueling homes really mean to us? It means an urgent challenge that we need to address in Scotland. It's urgent because our housing stock is really rather old. It's the oldest in comparison to the rest of Europe, but we have the largest proportion of old housing stock. And at the same time, we have very different kinds of ownership of that housing stock. So it's ranging from tenements to people who are in social housing, outright ownerships, etc. So there are all kinds of ownership models that is informing how we relate to our homes. So when we talk about fueling homes, it becomes a kind of technical challenge of how do we fuel the homes, but also individually, we live in homes. Homes, that's where livelihood happens, and it's really diverse, and it's an urgent challenge for us to address.
And Ken, this isn't a new problem, and you speak about your own work that's been happening for more than a decade now, maybe even further. You know, what are some of the key challenges that we've had, and what are some of the things that we're still struggling with here in Scotland?
Well, we have a whole set of multiple dimensions of problems, I suppose. At one level, we have a problem of convincing people about the importance of it and how act in their own lives to make changes to their own housing consumption. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in is how you design public policies that help reach and achieve the kind of goals of decarbonisation that we're seeking to do. And I completely agree with Mette that we have fundamental challenges because the housing stock is so idiosyncratic, and we have many individual housing challenges in almost every property. One of the things that economists always say about housing is that one of its fundamental kind of characteristics is it's everywhere, it's heterogeneous. In other words, every single property is unique and will have unique challenges and problems. And in one of our research projects, we found that even this was in the case of a Victorian tenement, and we expected it to be expensive and costly to repair and make the changes that needed to be made. But even despite surveys and work already done, we actually went into the property and started work. It was much, much worse than expected. And that's just one small 8-unit block. Sometimes it won't be as bad as that, but you don't know till you get into it. So the fabric and the quality of the fabric is incredibly challenging. But because our housing is older, we have to address the fabric as well. So we often talk about fabric first outcomes. And being a housing person, I obviously probably start from that point. But it's not just about that. It's many more things. But so I think there are many challenges about housing specifically, but also about convincing people, and also about finding the resources to do it and making a fair, just transition, which doesn't disadvantage particularly already disadvantaged groups.
And you mentioned there this research project that you've been involved in around a tenement. And for anyone who is listening and is outside of Scotland, or maybe isn't from Scotland, tenements are quite unique to Scottish architecture. And personally, I've lived in a tenement, and I also know that they can be quite challenging when you want to do anything with them, really, let alone try to improve the energy efficiency. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that project, because it had quite a buzz around it when COP26 came to Glasgow, the United Nations Climate Summit. But I'd love to hear more about all the different perspectives and disciplines that were actually brought into that. Okay. So I'd love to hear more. So
this was a Scottish Funding Council project which we won, a climate emergency competition. And essentially it was a demonstration project to see whether it was possible and at what cost and at what benefit to effectively retrofit a Victorian tenement from the 1890s, 8 one-bedroom flats in the south side of Glasgow, whether it was possible to turn that into an ENERFIT property, which is effectively passive house for retrofit. And it involved architects, it involved an academic architect, it involved myself, it involved Glasgow City Council and the Scottish Government, and it involved the Housing Association, who had acquired the property from the council through a compulsory purchase order from a private landlord. So it was disastrous timing, because the days after they got the keys to the property and we had the launch event, lockdown happened in 2020. And so we were in a situation where we had this great, really cool evaluation project ready to rock, which was multidisciplinary and all sorts of interesting technical and economic and social things going on around it. But we had no planning permission, we had no building control permission, we had no funding at that point for beyond the purchase of the property. So it took about 18 months to get all that sorted out. And one of the best arguments in favour of interdisciplinarity is simply to be exposed to it. And I was massively exposed to that during that period, because I spent every month we'd meet for about 18 months online on a Teams call. And it was like every day was a school day. I learned so much from the technical people, the architects, etc., the Housing Association, about what was really involved in this and what our options were. And then really fascinating thing about the project for me was we didn't really have an end point of what we were going to do. And it all just kind of developed over the sort of second half of 2021, and we ended up with a project which finally took off and worked well and garnered a huge amount of interest. The tenants came in. That happened alongside the cost of living crisis, and we were able to demonstrate, despite the high cost, and the project was expensive, despite the high cost, we were able to generate massive savings on people's fuel bills at a time of real challenge. And that's a great way of pulling to the present the notion that there are these benefits, payoffs from good energy efficiency things somewhere in the future, once enough people take up all those things. Here we had in 2022 3 the evidence right there and then of what could be done. So we have 8 pretty happy social tenants living in that property, which is not quite Enerfit, but 95% of the way there. And the other big thing we've learned is that you don't really need to have it as extreme as Enerfit to achieve almost all of the goals you want to achieve.
And I think it is a great tangible example that you can actually see the images and the progress and hear the stories. But I think it's interesting to hear your insights in that interdisciplinary working space. Mette, I know you touched on there some of the projects that you've been doing. How have you found it with the projects that you've done to work in such an interdisciplinary way?
I have found it exciting, I would say, first of all, but also challenging. It's difficult, it's hard. It's exciting for me because it's a little bit like what Ken was just saying. It's like every day is new, right? And it really depends on who you're working with, what discipline they're coming from, the kind of conversations that you might then have about the research that you've been doing yourself. So it's pushing you in new directions that you wouldn't have thought of perhaps otherwise. But it's also just encouraging you to be open-minded in a way that for me is refreshing. It's challenging because it can also then, you can feel like you're standing on this uneven or kind of almost like shifting sand, like you never quite know what's going to come. You might not feel so confident in your methodology because you can always put a question mark at the end of it. It can be a bit, it can pull you back almost sometimes into discussions about, I find, particularly with methods, that can just feel old. Do we really need to continue with this kind of hierarchy between qualitative and quantitative methodologies? So I would love, when I'm involved in interdisciplinary projects, for people to approach those projects with a deep sense of empathy and sympathy for each other's approaches, so that we don't end up just repeating old discussions.
If I can maybe just add to that, when we started in this project in the south of Glasgow, the architects were really clear that we needed to do post-occupancy surveys. We needed to see how people lived in the retrofitted units. And this really chimed with what my colleagues in other parts of my research centre, who are urban designers, talk about all the time. They've recently done a big project looking at the challenges of new housing design and its adequacy or inadequacy for a whole bunch of social, environmental reasons. And in the project we did, and we're still doing post-occupancy survey work, and it is really amazing because you start on paper with a model which determines the theoretical outcomes that you'll get out of these homes if the work is done as anticipated. But as we found in other projects, people don't actually operate like automatons. They go into houses and they use them in different ways, and they have their own preferences. We have one tenant in the Nidri Road project who likes it really warm. He just likes it really warm, and that has externality effects on everybody else. But what we found in another project recently, and just backs up this kind of behavioural thing, is that the behaviour of people is really critical to all this, and you have to understand how they're actually going to use these things. So we had this other project with new homes, and the new homes were designed in such a way that they wanted to maximise the energy efficiency, and they were passive house and everything. But they took really insufficient account of how the people would actually use the properties, and some use them exactly as planned, but others had perfectly rational and sensible reason not to, but to use it in different ways. And I've just been really struck by how that kind of very qualitative behavioural account is essential to really, trying to find some sensible compromise between these in theory, on paper, design ideas, as opposed to the reality of how any of us had to actually live in these things.
And I guess as well with time that changes as well, because your project came right before COVID. And one thing that stands out a lot in terms of home use and COVID is working from home,
Indeed.
which has also changed a huge part of how people use their homes, whether that is now a dedicated little corner that is a desk and a study space, and you've got to think about your heating and your lighting and your electricity, and just how much time people are at home and their commute has changed. But I'm interested, you've both spoken there about the different dynamics as part of these interdisciplinary teams, and you've touched on hierarchy maybe, but I'm just wondering, what are the power dynamics like and the relationships like between the different disciplines? And when you are trying to do something quite collaboratively, are there any disciplines that try to come out on top or try to move it much, or even if you don't want to give away too much, even just is there areas that you've felt that tension before?
Well, I'll maybe start. So my research centre is interdisciplinary, it's multidisciplinary in the sense that we have a number of different disciplines represented, and we often collaborate, and sometimes individual disciplines just run the whole project. It kind of depends. But we've certainly, particularly in the first couple of years, there was very much a sense from social science colleagues that economists were different, and they were maybe less collaborative and more of a sense of being less engaged with some of the other disciplines. We've worked incredibly hard internally to kind of upend that. And it's really, I think, been made possible because I think the 3 or 4 preeminent economists, I just mean that the people who kind of shout the loudest in the centre, myself included, are all kind of heterodox in our economic views. So we're more comfortable talking about institutions and power relations and qualitative work and the sense that the economy doesn't work very well and we shouldn't model it as if it does. That kind of starting point. So that's definitely helped, but that's not stopped the economists amongst us in that group thinking at times, well, we're actually not getting a fair shout here, and so that it can work both ways. But I know that in the broader space, there's no doubt that economists would have that perspective. I think that most other social scientists would hold, and not without reason.
Yeah, I think in my experience, it's particularly one of my other hats is as the director of the Centre for Energy Ethics at St Andrews. And that's a research centre where we involve all disciplines right across art, humanities, social and natural sciences. And we have more than 100 researchers. And in that space, I feel like it's less about disciplines and it's almost more about where people are in their careers. I feel like, especially when we launched the centre also during COVID, so in 2020, and the very well-established professors were more difficult to get on board, not on what the centre is about when it comes to energy ethics, but the interdisciplinarity of it. And we are a truly interdisciplinary centre, so it's part of our ethos. And there was kind of pushback, I would say, from people who were really well positioned in their careers. And I understand that they would also perhaps be the ones who had for the longest been working, to establish themselves in their careers and had been successful in doing so, perhaps more within their own disciplines. And the early career researchers were so excited, just so keen to get involved, and they were driving so much fantastic research. And you could say, well, they are also at a place in their careers where they're not perhaps yet so disciplined in the social sense. But then on the other hand, you could also flip it and say, actually, there's more at stake. If you're an early career researcher, interdisciplinarity could be a bigger risk to your career, because if you are working in an interdisciplinary space, there's a lot, especially now with REF, that is still cementing disciplines, where interdisciplinarity can be seen as a bit of a risk to your own career. What journals are you going to publish in? What departments and schools are you going to apply for jobs in? What kind of courses are you going to be teaching? And where you could say that for those very senior professors, they could be so open-minded and embrace interdisciplinarity because they have already established themselves. The Centre for Energy Ethics, we're now 5 years old, and it's great to see that actually now we have seen a shift, and we have some of these fantastic professors that are really leading some great research at St Andrews, centrally involved in the centre. But it's a journey.
Yeah, and I am myself a PhD student, and I think sometimes interdisciplinarity can on one hand be romanticised as this incredible kind of value ethos that's going to change the world in every setting. But then there is also this tension of, but you might just become a jack of all trades and an expert of none, because you're kind of spreading yourself too thin. And yeah, the logistics of where are you going to put your work, and what bucket are you going to, put all of your work into and try and be published. But I also want to ask you about the artist in residence that you've had as part of that, because that to me is, I was going to say, one of the extremes of interdisciplinarity, which almost makes it sound like a negative, but I'd love to talk about the journey that you went on, including that as part of your centre.
Yeah. So, of course, when you establish a research centre, it's a long process. And it all starts basically with a piece of paper and a pen, and you put thoughts down. And because the Centre for Energy Ethics is interdisciplinary at its core, we thought a lot about how do we actually facilitate that kind of interdisciplinarity at a university like St Andrews, where we are divided into departments and schools. And I have done previously several collaborations with artists, and some of the artists were installation artists, others were filmmakers, and I really enjoyed those collaborations. I have felt my conceptual world was broadened, and it was challenged in a way that just felt exhilarating. And so when we thought about the Centre for Energy Ethics and how do we actually truly get the chemists out of the labs and talk to the art historians or talk to our philosophers or our economists, how do we get them all to communicate in a way that is productive of something? And that's a question of itself, like what should we be productive of? But I thought that artists are able to create a place where there's no right or wrong. And that is crucial for interdisciplinarity, in my opinion. When we look, let's say, at an art installation, there's no one way of looking at it. You can look at it in your way. I can look at it in my way. It's totally opened. And if we could create a research center where we have that openness, then I think we have a good basis for interdisciplinarity. And
Ken, I think, we've talked a lot in this episode about interdisciplinarity from a research perspective, but you also did begin to talk a lot about, in the context of these tenements, this project that you did actually is people that end up influencing a lot of this. How do we do interdisciplinary work, research, but beyond just the academic sphere? So including lived experience, including other stakeholders, whether that's business, third sector, what are some of the ways that we can be including that in the projects that we do?
I think you have to make a big commitment to it. And what I mean by that is our research centre was funded as an evidence centre by the ESRC. So we are explicitly meant to, curate, gather, produce evidence that's a kind of synthesis of what we know and a recognition of what we don't know. And then we have to communicate it as effectively as possible. And that is about knowledge mobilisation fundamentally. So we invested a lot in that role. So first and foremost, we set up knowledge exchange hubs around the country. So the whole of the UK is covered by our hubs. Our hubs are populated by a kind of overview of the sector, the housing sector, public, private sector, government, third parties, etc. Both analytical people as well as kind of leaders. And we have dedicated knowledge exchange staff, but we also have a kind of requirement that our academics really work hard at communicating in non-technical ways, some quite technical stuff. And what we are, in a sense, talking about today is often very technical. So there's a real onus to find ways to do that. But almost all of the aspects of housing research that we do, there is a lived experience dimension to it, and it takes different forms. And, there's a whole set of ethical issues to manage with that. And we have to be really aware of, that we are inviting people to think about perhaps some of the disadvantage and horror that they've lived through for different reasons. So we have to be really, really careful and cautious in all of those things, and we do that. But it's like someone once said to me, we need to do external relations in our research centre, but it's got huge, what economists call shoe leather costs. It never stops being costly. You build networks, you have to maintain those networks, you have to evolve those networks, you have to keep at it all the time. And no one's perfect at it, and it's really hard work. But I guess my view would be that 2 or 3 people who've stayed with us throughout our life are extremely good at it in cash. We've got 3 long-term knowledge exchange officers, and they are brilliant at it. They're that great thing. They're really consistent as well, and that's more than anything, that's what it's about.
And I think it's great to hear, what are the actual roles and steps that you can be taking to not only make something interdisciplinary, but actually help with the impact that project will have. And Ken, I know that you've done a lot of research that has worked towards or actually worked with councils, local authorities, the government to try and get policy change. Yeah. What are some of the most effective ways that we can be doing research that's interdisciplinary, that is actually working towards policy change for the better?
I think you have to have a relationship with the right civil servants, and hopefully with politicians as well, both at national and local government level. And in doing that, you have to work with their agendas to some extent. And so it's hard to shift paradigms. It's a lot easier to find the challenges that they're facing, that they're trying to work with. So to give you an example, we helped set up a new housing tenure in Northern Ireland, which essentially created a midpoint between market renting and social renting, for which there wasn't anything of it. There wasn't an available, affordable rental market option, and we found a way to do that without grant funding it. And then we went through all the legal due diligence and everything, and they've now, the spades have broken the ground and they're building houses on that basis. But that was all about, doing what we were asked to do, but doing it seriously and promoting it to the entire Irish housing system and all the stakeholders involved. And you get there in the end. And I think with the project we talked about earlier, the Didry Road project, once we got politicians and leaders in the kind of climate change, decarbonisation world wanting to learn about the project, you learn as you do it, and you get better at it, and you start to think, well, how can we get the right kind of impacts? When you launch a conference, it's not actually about who you get to speak, but it's about who you can network with, and then try and build new projects and new things and new bits of influencing. So again, high shoe leather costs. You just have to keep at it.
And Mette, I know you've done a lot of projects outside of academia as well, but quite often with business and with other stakeholders. What's been your experience working in that interdisciplinary way outside of academia?
I would fully agree with Ken about the importance of relationships, cultivating those relationships, and really, I think, approach questions from others' point of view. I think sometimes maybe as academics, at least again, my own research as an anthropologist, I can find a point of view in relation to the scholarship that I'm engaging with. But if I want to work cross-sector, I have to be able to make the shift where I think about, okay, what is a point of view here of, say, a bank? What is in it for them? What can they contribute? What could their role be? And so really think a lot about the same issue, but kind of from the other side of the table. And in my experience, when I've been doing that, especially with the Alliance here in Scotland, we've worked a lot with financial partners. We have one theme that's financial pathways to net zero. And for investors, time horizons are totally different from academic time horizons. And you need to think about research projects in such a different way. It doesn't really align very well with our regular funders. So if we're doing cross-sector collaborative research with business, we can't spend 6 months writing a grant proposal, wait another 6 months to hear, and then another 6 months before we start. It doesn't work. So everything is much more compressed, and it's it's definitely a challenge area, I think, for cross-sectoral collaborative research.
I think it's been so interesting to actually hear, from both of you, the challenges, the exciting opportunities that comes with working in an interdisciplinary way. And actually some of the logistical points are what, certainly for me, earlier on in my research career, it's so good to know about. What advice would you give to people listening to this episode if they are thinking about the issue that they work on and wanting to broaden it to be more interdisciplinary, whether that's aligning with fueling homes or whatever topic they come from? Because there will be lots of people listening to this episode that are maybe PhD students, maybe undergraduate students, maybe early career researchers or people interested in academia. What would be some of the advice that you could give them when embarking on wanting to be more interdisciplinary themselves?
Well, that's the kind of question that I think always depends on what the person who's in front of you is actually, where they're coming from. But what I would say in general, I think, is that I'm struck that I heard a colleague say this at a conference a few years ago, and it's always stayed with me. If you want to invest a period of time working in a field of study, like say housing research, you need to know from your own academic discipline, what is the really hot topics? What's really important now? What are the coming trends that look to be important? And you need to understand what the public policy challenges in housing are now and emerging, going ahead. And you need to find locus of interest across those things and triangulate it. And that's hopefully where strong ideas come from. And then it's about talking to people about practical research ideas and finding out what the research funding environment is like for these things. So in my area, it's not simply research councils by any manner of means. It's not simply charities. It's government, local government, it's the private sector. So there's a whole manner of ways. But as Mette was just saying, you need to align your time horizons with what they want, and you need to do all of those things at the one time. And it's having that idea. I mean, you might be fortunate, and I was very lucky. I didn't really know anything about housing, and I just found my way into the front door to be a temporary research assistant, and I got interested in housing. But I was in a very strong research environment place that protected me for the early few years of my career. Those kind of lucky things are kind of rare to happen, I guess. It's nothing to do with me. It was the time that I was, the environment I was in. So I think those things are important, but that landing on a real sense of what's current and emerging, both in your discipline but also in the field of study that you want to investigate, is very important, I think.
Yeah, I think the advice I would give would probably be to be brave, be curious and be brave. Don't feel like you need to conform to anything. You create your future. And I would say the same to an undergraduate or a master's student's PhD, postdoc, I mean, you make your own future. Don't feel like there's one path and that's the one you should follow. Creating your own future means being open and being also proactive. Like, don't lean back and expect stuff to come to you. Go out there. Also embrace the uncomfortable. Like, you're going to find yourself probably at some convention or at some dinner and you might not know anyone, and then go and sit next to the person you don't know and have that conversation and see, what will happen. You never know.
Yeah, in a sense, you have to work with people who will support you so that they see that you deserve to be supported, and to give you the chances that will happen in successful research centres. It's doing both things. It's that being proactive and showing real intellectual curiosity, but also showing that there's a drive and a determination. It's
been so helpful to hear your experiences working in this field of housing and homes and fueling homes and climate change, sustainability, social issues. But because this whole podcast series is about interdisciplinarity, we wrap up each episode with the same question. And that is, do we still need disciplines? And I guess, thinking about this complex problem of fueling homes and housing, do we still need disciplines? Ken?
Yes, I think we do. I think part of the reason why research centre like mine works on an interdisciplinary basis is because we actually come from something we feel passionate about, and we all still read our discipline's work, and we all still sit and think about it. I was listening to conversation earlier, and I was thinking about 2 or 3 of the economists I really enjoy reading, and they are probably near the edge of the discipline, but they're very much economists, and I wouldn't have it any other way. So I like to hear other people's perspectives about the work that I do and what I'm thinking about, and I think that you need some kind of disciplinary element there. I think there's obviously space for people to work in a wholly transdisciplinary way, and I absolutely get that. I'm doing a lot of work now in systems thinking, and I really enjoy that. I always have done, but I kind of do drift towards a kind of economics perspective on it, but I really, really enjoy that, and I can see why people become complexity science people or systems thinkers, and they don't really bother with disciplinary names. But I still feel that there's enough value in the strengths of a discipline that creates a place where interdisciplinarity can be somehow stronger.
Mm. Yeah, I fully agree. I think with our disciplines, we gain depth in our knowledge, and that's crucial. And then when we have that depth, that's where we can then collaborate. You probably have another episode where you talk about the difference between multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and interdisciplinary. If we think about interdisciplinarity as bringing together multiple disciplines, and perhaps not necessarily distantly related disciplines, but disciplines that can be quite closely related, I think if you are able to have the depth of a single discipline and the methodological openness to other disciplines, developing your knowledge of the scholarship in other disciplines, going to conferences that are addressing themes rather than just a single discipline, you're able to advance our scholarship and our practice so much more than I think we could if we stayed only within our own discipline.
Well, those are definitely great perspectives to leave this episode on. So thank you so much, Professor Ken Gibb and Professor Mette, for being on this episode of the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
When Disciplines Meet is hosted by me, Laura Young, recorded at the Podcast Studio Glasgow, and edited by the operations team at the Scottish Graduate School of Social Science. The podcast was conceived by SGSSS's Deputy Director for Training, Dr. Katie Keenan, and Associate Director, Dr. Roxanne Connolly. SGSSS is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, the Scottish Funding Council, and our 16 partner universities. To find out more about the Scottish Graduate School of Social Science, you can visit our website at www.sgsss.ac.uk. Thank you for listening.